All right, world history. We are now talking about the collapse of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire in the age of the Caesars. And you guys kind of have a choice. You could either go through this video all in one class period, or you could break it up over a couple of days and perhaps spend some of the time talking about Hannibal and the activity that you have to do that's due on Friday. You'll also be doing another map activity related to this and identifying the extent of the vast Roman Empire during this period right before Christ and in the centuries following. All right, Roman civilization, and we are now on section 2. The Roman Empire emerges. So what led to the dictatorship of the Republic, the problems, the failure of reform, the Civil War, the several civil wars, and then finally the Augustus and the Pax Romana, which is the emergence of the Roman Empire, the Imperium. And the successors of Augustus, and here we want to talk about the fact that many of these men died violent deaths. There was no true succession of power that was peaceful, the way it happens, for instance, in our republic, where you serve a 4-year term. If you don't get reelected, you give way to the winner. In the ancient world, power often transferred in a violent form because there was no notion of a peaceful transfer of power. What was the Pax Romana? What role did Augustus play in establishing the Pax Romana? And I want you guys to look at the very positive things that he brought, but of course it didn't bring a true peace, it was more of a civic peace, right? And what rulers followed, and how did many of them end? So first, we're coming to the problems at the end of the Republican era. The economic and military backbone of the early republic was the hardworking citizen farmer. Now, as you look here at the beginning of this section, you see that there's going to be a reason why these farmers became landless and therefore became impoverished. So I want you to look real quick here, stop the tape, and what led to the economic decline of these citizen farmers. All right, so having had a chance to review that, the tribal assembly had greatly increased in power. However, the conditions that devastated the poor provided opportunities for increased prosperity for the already wealthy landholders whose interests the Senate represented. So you have this increasing conflict between the tribal assembly, which, remember, that was associated with the plebeians, and the Senate, which was primarily associated with the patricians. And yet we saw how those two classes sort of transform into a rich versus poor, a haves versus have-nots in the 2 centuries before Christ, the end of the first millennium BC. So did the Senate help the landless and poor? What does it say here on page 80? Well, they didn't. They were very selfish, and they were looking out for themselves, as people in power often do. The phrase power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, is in play in this kind of a situation. And the corruption of the government in Rome spread to the Roman provinces. Remember, they're controlling the entire Mediterranean world, so there's all these different provinces. And because there's corruption at the head, at the source, the corruption feeds out into the various members. So what were the publicans and how do they oppress the people in the provinces? So pause and take a look at that. The publicans, of course, were tax collectors, and they were allowed to shave off the top. They had a certain amount that they had to send back to the central government, but they were allowed to press you for more. And if you know your Bible, you know that one of the apostles was one of these publicans. And in fact, Jesus says when you put someone outside the church, treat him as a Gentile and a publican, a tax collector. That shows you how despised, even Jesus can sort of pick up on how negatively these guys were viewed. And Zacchaeus, right? He's one of these publicans in the Gospel of Luke. So here we have a map showing, during the Punic Wars, the expansion of the Roman Republic. And we went over a little bit of this at the end of section 1. Then we have increasing expansion both west and east. In the middle of the 2nd century, the conquest of Greece, which of course had a tremendous cultural impact on Rome. And here we see, this is kind of summarizing where the rest of this section is going, pointing out the Rubicon River, which is the famous river that Julius Caesar crosses. And that's where we get the phrase crossing the Rubicon. You sort of commit to an action and there's no way you can go back on it. And you kind of roll the dice. And then the Battle of Actium, which is where Augustus Caesar ends up conquering Mark Antony and solidifying his power. So getting back to the decline of the Republic, the poor found champions for their cause in the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. The Gracchus brother, the Gracchi, right? That's the plural of Gracchus. What year was Tiberius elected tribune? So again, this is 2nd century BC. Tiberius proposed changes in Rome's land policy. He's trying to bring some aid to these impoverished and landless citizens who are clamoring for relief. However, things didn't go so well. What happened to Tiberius when he sought re-election? Can you see it there on the page? These powerful people in the Senate sought to put an end to him. And so his brother comes to power. Gaius becomes tribune, and he sought to carry on his brother's land reform measures. And again, what was the Senate's response? So you can see this at the bottom of page 80 and the top of page 81. And this leads to a period at the end of the 2nd century and into the 1st century of civil war. So no longer are we dealing with these external threats, such as wars with Greece or wars with the Carthaginians, but now it is Roman against Roman. So the First Civil War, following the deaths of the Gracchi brothers, the common people find a new champion in Marius. That question mark means that we're not sure exactly when he was born, and that's often the case with famous people, just because of the records being unclear, but we know what year that he died. How did Marius change the structure of the Roman army? This is quite significant because it's going to lead to the transformation of Rome into this military power and violent transfers of power, and the base of power was, can you lead the army? Can you control the army? That's how Julius Caesar comes to power. That's how Augustus is going to come to power, etc., etc. So war breaks out in Asia Minor in the east. Sulla is appointed by the Senate, but the tribal assembly decides to appoint a rival commander. And so therefore, civil war breaks out. Sulla is victorious, but as you can see, he doesn't live much longer than Marius. And so he has himself declared dictator and seeks to reorganize the Roman government. Then he resigns, but the Senate is unable to maintain control of the government. So any effort to bring back the Republic to its glory, it's continuing to fail. This leads to a second civil war. Crassus and Pompey, two commanders who served in Sulla's army. So again, we're talking about the first half of the 1st century BC. They compete with one another for fame and power. And then comes on the stage Julius Caesar. And he won popular support over these two other guys. They formed an alliance called the Triumvirate in 60 BC. However, they weren't content with this. Each sought in different ways to gain control over Rome. And Julius had a particular way of keeping his name before the people back home. And what was that? What does your book say here at the bottom of page 81? So he's off in Gaul, conquering the Gauls, Gallia, right? And the Galli, the Gauls. And so now you have some idea about the origin of Caesar's Gallic Wars. He himself is writing dispatches from the front about his accomplishments as a way to, so in other words, he's not just reciting history. He's not just doing this for the sake of vanity. He's not just doing this for the sake of history. Like, I want to really make sure that, people 2,000 years later are going to know what happened. No, he's doing this as kind of a form of propaganda, as a way to prop himself up by showing his accomplishments and his skill and his accomplishments and his victory, right? Victoriae, there as a way of increasing his political power back home, so that when he does come home, he's going to be very well known. Generals often have, throughout history, had a way of ascending to power. Think about several of our presidents. Obviously, our first president, right? He won the War for Independence against Great Britain. And so Washington becomes a natural choice. He's a proven leader. And so even though there wasn't really an election per se, he ends up becoming the first president. Although actually, if you look at the Articles of Confederation before the Constitution is ratified, there were actually presidents before Washington. There's an interesting talk by George Grant about, I think it's the 7 presidents before Washington. You should look that up. But again, think of other presidents that we've had who were great leaders. Can you think of some? Andrew Jackson, right? War of 1812, he's a very popular leader and leads to him becoming president. Ulysses S. Grant, we've talked about him, right? And he is a very successful general in the Civil War, our Civil War, and he leads to becoming president. What about the 20th century? Well, Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ike Eisenhower, he leads the war in Europe, conquering the Nazis, and he is swept into office in 1952 and serves 2 terms as our president. So anyway, all that to say is that if you are successful in battle, it will often lead you to positions of political power. That doesn't always work out so well, but for somebody like Julius and Augustus, it does lead to a period of power and rule. So Caesar crosses the Rubicon. He comes back to Rome, not for the purpose that the Senate asked him to, but for the purpose of establishing his authority and his rule, and him becoming a new dictator or imperator. So he has himself proclaimed dictator for life, and this begins the era of the Caesars, the era of the emperors, the transformation of Rome from a republic into an empire, an imperium. Now, what were some of the reforms that Caesar implemented? So we can stop here, and you can look at page 82. And so one of the things that you see here, and as we'll see with Augustus, is that, you know, they become dictators, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they were completely harmful to the people. Some of the things that they established were decent ideas. But some people don't like him, and so in 44 BC, you have a group of conspirators who assassinate Caesar, and this is where the famous phrase from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, et tu, Brute, one of his friends, so-called, was Brutus, and Cassius, and they conspire against him. If you've never seen Julius Caesar, I would certainly highly recommend it. Not that it's completely factual, but it is a wonderful, dramatic exploration of, you know, what do you do when you don't like a guy, and what are the consequences for that? Because the reforms that Brutus wants to bring in don't lead very well, are not successful. And that's what leads us to the Third Civil War. So you have a successor, a nephew of Julius, Octavian, and then Mark Antony, who is based out of Egypt. And if you know the name Cleopatra, I believe that's Mark Antony's consort in Egypt. Anyway, just as there was a triumvirate in the previous generation, so there's this rule of 2, but of course that doesn't last very long. People tend to not want to share power. They were too ambitious, and so they end up leading to this further war. And that eventually leads to a decisive victory, as you saw on the map, in southwestern Greece, the Battle of Actium. And again, you'll want to need to know that for your test. That's why this is highlighted. So here is Pompey. Here is Julius Caesar. You can see some similarities actually to the picture we saw of Hannibal in the other section. Okay, what tasks did publicans perform in Roman society? Again, we had a chance to pause and look at this. They collected taxes, and they were despised for it because they didn't do it fairly. They didn't do it justly. They did it in a way to oppress the people and enrich themselves. What were the names of the two brothers who became the spokesman? Again, these were the Gracchi. What were their names? Tiberius and Gaius. And again, these guys are end of the 2nd century, 131, 123 BC. The two generals who fought in the First Civil War, what were their names and which political assembly backed which one? Okay, one starts with an S and one starts with the M. So Sulla is backed by the Senate. That's the way you can kind of remember them. And Marius is backed by the tribal assembly. Who are the three rulers of the triumvirate? Certainly there's one you can remember, right? There were two others who were clamoring for power: Crassus, Pompey, and Julius Caesar. And again, this is the getting down into the 1st century BC, about 70 years before Christ. And then finally, the Third Civil War. What place and in what year did Octavian defeat Antony in the Third Civil War? Well, it was 31 BC, the Battle of Actium. So again, you had this period from the end of the 2nd century down to the end of the 1st century BC, where you have these three civil wars that leads to the collapse of the Republic, and that brings us to a new era from res publica now into imperium. The three civil wars set a pattern for the duration of the existence of the Roman Empire. Hopefully your answer is yes, right? Violence becomes the method of choice. So this is this transformation of the army that happens in the previous centuries, and that, you know, this whole concept of might makes right is what we see happening here. So how were the concepts of justice and power abused during the Roman civil wars? You can see some sidebars. The pink sidebars are where we talk about these themes running through these different civilizations. So sometimes they wanted to help the commoners, but sometimes they simply wanted to protect the wealthy, or they simply wanted to line their own pockets. So justice and power, how do you balance these two? Are you, again, is it might for right, or is it simply might makes right? All right, a short section here at the end of section 2, Augustus and the Pax Romana. So he starts off saying that he's going to restore the Republic, but that's basically a cloak. He takes the title of princeps, all right, and some of you have learned this Latin word. The leading man, the chief man, we get our word prince from this. But it was no longer really a republic, but an empire, an imperium ruled by an imperator. So the commander of a victorious army. And that's the reason why, you know, for those of you who are in the Latin class, imperator means both general and commander-in-chief, but then also emperor, right? And again, it's the idea that the guy who's going to be on top is not someone who is elected. He's not someone who's necessarily fit politically or the wisest man, but he's the guy who can, who can kill the bad guy, who can kill the enemy. And so therefore, he's the guy who's deemed worthy to rule, because of course he has the means of stopping you if you try to stop him. He's got the power of the army behind him. So they confer the title of Augustus on him. Hopefully that's familiar to you, right? Hopefully the words Julius and Augustus, right? You might ask yourselves, why is September, a word that means 7, the 9th month of the year? Why is the word October a word that means 8. Why is it the 10th month of the year? Well, it's because these guys, Julius and Augustus, become so dominant on the stage of world history that they end up creating 2 new months. They end up displacing the previous months and inserting these guys into July and into August. So his rule brings a period of peace called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace that lasts for a century and a half. Well, really almost 2 centuries, right? 2 centuries. And so look in your book here, what were some of the good things that happened during these 2 centuries? And yet, according to page 83, why was it not a true peace? You know, we have peace in our country, relatively speaking, and yet, if you don't know Christ, you know, it's that bumper sticker, no Christ, no peace, K-N-O-W. No Christ, N-O Christ, N-O peace, okay? It's only with Christ that you can have true peace, because that's only with him that you can have peace with God, Romans 5, verse 1. So again, during this time, the entire Mediterranean world enjoyed economic prosperity. Name 3 things that indicated this prosperity. He brought stability and order. What policies led to this stability? You can see here on page 84. And he sought to abolish corruption in the provincial governments, to put a check on these publicans. And yet, his efforts to change morals failed. And of course, that's because, again, only Christ can bring about true moral reform. We need a Pax Christi. So here is a map. Now just think about the eastern side of this, the right side of this map, okay? You know, that's half of the Persian Empire, right? And then you have this entire European side of things and North African side of things. Britannia, way up in the northwest, Gaul, which becomes Francia later. So this is just a vast empire, and it created somewhat of a common culture. You know, there's a reason why people still study Latin today. There's a reason why, you know, you have these Romance languages. Can you remember what the Romance languages are? You can see all the countries here impacted by them. Well, Italia, right, Italian, Francia, French, Hispania, Spain, but then you've also got Romania, which would be over there where Dacia is, or Macedonia. You've got Romania, and then Portuguese, right? Part of Spain becomes Portugal, and so there's a linguistic heritage, there is a military heritage, there's a political heritage. So it's very significant, and continues to have an impact even down to today when you think about the formation of our own government and other Western democracies. The successors of Augustus left no plan for choosing a successor, and so you have these men who have some kind of tie to Julius. Book of Revelation, you read about 10 kings that is thought to be a reference to these various emperors. One who gets resurrected in the sense that with the death of Nero, you kind of have the death of the reign of Caesar, and yet it ends up being carried on and kind of coming back to life around AD 70 through a guy named Vespasian and a guy named Titus. And again, this whole idea of might makes right, now it becomes the army that's going to choose. It's not the Senate, it's not the tribal assembly, it's not the vote of the people, it's going to be the army. And so this is, if you're familiar with the term military dictatorship, that's kind of what's going on in the Roman Empire. And as a result, civil war often erupts. So look here briefly at the end of the section. How many different emperors were there in the 3rd century AD? And how did they come to their end? Again, not a peaceful transition of power as we see in our tradition, but violence. All right, section 2b. What's the name of the period of peace, right? You know it, Pax Romana. 2 titles or names by which Octavian was called. One is named after, we have a month named after it. Augustus and Princeps. What did Octavian institute to provide for fairer taxing? A census, right? So instead of having these publicans in power, you had this census, and of course this overlaps directly with the biblical account in the birth of Christ, Luke chapter 2. How did many of the self-seeking corrupt emperors of the late empire win the favor of the people? So, bread and circuses is a phrase that's often associated with the Roman Empire. Bread and circuses, that's how you keep the people entertained, you keep their stomachs full, you allow them to come to the circus and see gladiators or see races, chariot races, those kinds of things. Think of Ben-Hur. Why were the citizens of Augustus' kingdom unable to obey, while the citizens of Christ's kingdom were able? Christ can actually transform your heart, right? The promise of the new covenant, I will write their laws. I will write my law on their hearts. Augustus can only give extra. What lessons can we take? Augustus sought to remove unqualified self-seeking people and instead bring in able. So, more of bringing skilled people, not just people who can bribe you. So this is relevant as we're looking at an election coming up here in our own country. All right, thank you for your time, and make sure you get in the maps related to Hannibal, and you're also going to have to do an activity related to this section in terms of the expansion of the Roman Empire.